In this video, I'm going to discuss concepts and variables, which are kind of like the building blocks of research. If you don't know what your concepts or variables are, then you're in deep trouble. You don't really have a research topic, okay? And let's talk about that word topic. When you write a research paper in an undergraduate course, you have a topic, right? Maybe you write a paper about horror movies, or maybe you write a paper about Abraham Lincoln, or maybe you write a paper about tennis. I'm just throwing out random topics here. You have a topic, right? It's not enough for purposes of this course and for purposes of doing the kind of research we're talking about in this course. It's not enough to just have a topic. You need to figure out what are the qualities or the characteristics of that topic that interest you, that you want to investigate. And until you have that figured out, you don't really have anything to go on. So you got to figure out what are those concepts and variables. So that means you need to pop open the hood and you need to actually get messy and look at the engine and examine the individual parts and how they work together when you are doing research for purposes of this course. So let's talk about what we mean by concepts and also by variables. So we're going to start with that term concepts. Now, a concept is not a concrete thing that you can touch, okay? So a professor is not a concept. A student is not a concept. A class or a course is not a concept. A computer is not a concept. Those are all tangible things or tangible people that you could actually touch. Concepts live in the world of abstraction. So a concept is an abstract idea that we plan to study. In other words, the characteristics of the people or things we study. So I said that a class or an academic course is not a concept, and it's not. But a course has certain qualities, okay? For example, modality, I guess is the word we might attach to this. Is it an in-person course or is it an online course? That's the different modalities. So modality would be an example of a concept. I said that a professor is not a concept, which is true, but a professor could be male or female. So, gender would be an example of a concept. If you are interested in social media, I would say by itself is not a concept. It's a broad topic. It's not a concept. You would have to go much narrower and much deeper to figure out what are the characteristics of social media that you are interested in. Maybe you're interested in misinformation. That could be a concept. And you could even get narrower than that and say, I'm interested in examining the speed with which misinformation travels on social media. So my concept might be speed. Or maybe I'm interested in how people yell and scream on social media. So maybe my concept might be civility or incivility. That could be an example of a concept. So here are just some other examples. There are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of concepts that you could study. I've just thrown a few examples up here on the slide, like self-esteem or violence or interactivity or corporate social responsibility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you'll notice that what all of these things have in common is that they are not tangible things that we can directly see or touch, but they are qualities that live in our minds. They are abstractions. So these are just some examples of concepts. You have to figure out what the relevant concepts are for topics that you are personally interested in. So once you've figured out what your concepts are, you have to be able to define them. Researchers make a big fuss out of being able to define your terms. Otherwise, people don't know what you're referring to. If I just say modality or civility or something like that, a lot of people are going to be like, what the heck are you talking about? So until you define your terms, they're not really going to have any meaning. So let's talk about conceptual definitions versus operational definitions. So a conceptual definition is kind of like a dictionary definition. It defines a concept by substituting other simpler words or concepts for it. And I'll show you an example in just a minute. So the conceptual definition is kind of like the dictionary definition. But now, as a researcher, if we are doing quantitative research, remember, quantitative research involves numbers, it involves measurement. So I would have to be, if I'm going to do a quantitative study, like a survey or a content analysis, and I want to study something like civility, for example, or credibility, or job satisfaction, I need to figure out how I am going to measure that concept, how I'm going to be able to turn it into something that is measurable or observable. And that is where an operational definition comes into play. So an operational definition of a concept is one that specifies how the concept will be measured. If you're doing a qualitative study where you're not measuring anything, then you may not need operational definitions. But for quantitative studies, you definitely do. Otherwise, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to come up with things like survey questions. Okay, so that's the distinction between conceptual and operational definitions. So just to give you an example of this, let's say that the concept I'm interested in studying is political bias. Now, what I think of as political bias might be different from what you think of as political bias. So as a researcher, I need to define my terms. I need to be clear up front what I mean when I use the phrase political bias. So a conceptual definition of political bias would be like a dictionary definition. And it might be something like what you see on the slide. A tendency, especially one that is unreasoned or preconceived, to favor one particular political party or belief over another. I think I stole that definition from somewhere. I don't remember where, but that's an example of a conceptual definition, defining the term political bias by substituting other words and phrases for it. Now, if I were going to do a study where I actually were going to measure political bias, quantify it, I would need to also have an operational definition. So I might operationalize political bias by comparing the number of times that Republicans are mentioned versus the number of times that Democrats are mentioned, and then look for differences or imbalances between the two. Operationally, that might be what I mean by political bias. You know, Democrats are mentioned 24 times, Republicans are only mentioned 12 times. Therefore, this news story, document, video, whatever, is biased in favor of the Democrats because of my operational definition of political bias. So that just gives you one example. Now, if we are going to do a quantitative study and we are going to measure stuff, we want to take our concepts and we actually want to turn them into variables. So if you've taken any science-y courses, you may have already learned a thing or two about variables, independent variables versus dependent variables. They are also discussed in the assigned reading for this week. But let me say a few words about what variables are and the different types of variables. So the word variable comes from the word vary, which means in order for something to be a variable, it has to be something that changes or varies. Not everything is a variable, okay? So if you say, you know, students enjoy their classes, and I ask you, what are the variables in that sentence? And you say, well, students. No, students aren't a variable. Students are there, but you know, there's no variation. You don't have like 2 or 3 different groups of students. Students in and of themselves are not a variable. Same goes for classes. Classes is not a variable, it's just a thing, right? So, but if you start to say something like undergraduate students prefer online courses, whereas graduate students prefer in-person courses. I think it would be more likely to be the opposite, but there you go. Now you've actually got variables, right? Because you've got stuff that varies. Undergraduate versus graduate students. So that academic standing would be a variable, and modality would be a variable, because you've got in-person versus online. So now you actually do have some variables. So a variable is that quality of an individual or an object that can be measured and that varies among individuals or among objects. The two main types of variables are independent and dependent variables. So usually when we work with variables, we are thinking in terms of cause and effect relationships. Something causes something else, or something influences something else. So the variable that we believe to be the cause or the predictor is our independent variable, or IV. And the variable we believe to be the effect or the outcome is our dependent variable, or DV. Now we know that some relationships are not quite so simple, because there may be other factors that come into play, what we would call third variables. So a third variable is another factor that may intervene and affect the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Now, I know sometimes it's a little hard to remember which is which. Which one is the cause, which one is the effect? What's the difference again between independent and dependent? So let's talk about some ways to remember which is which. So one way to think about these is to think of it as the independent variable causes the dependent variable. The IV causes the DV. Or the way other people think of it, and either of these is fine, whichever works best for you, is to think of it as in this manner. The dependent variable's value depends on, that's why it's the dependent variable, dependent variable's value depends on the value that the independent variable takes. In other words, the DV depends on the IV. Those are two ways that you can think about that relationship between an independent and a dependent variable. Here is another way to think of it. This is a cute little trick, okay? I came up with all by myself, so you can thank me for this. If you can't decide which variable is the independent and which one is the dependent, all you need to remember is the word decide. What are the first two letters of decide? D and E. Dependent, effect. The dependent variable is the effect, DE. Okay? You can even take it a step further and look at the next two letters and decide, which are C and I. C is cause, I is independent. The cause is the independent variable. And then the last two letters, again, are D and E. Dependent is effect. So if you can remember the word decide and how it's split up into groups of two letters, DE, CI, DE, that will help you remember which is which one is the effect, which one is the cause. So let's look at some examples of this, because until we look at some actual examples, I know this all seems a little bit hazy. So what we have here are some hypothetical research hypotheses. And they are written in the form of a hypothesis, a declarative statement that makes a prediction about the relationship between two or more variables. Let's look at them and let's reason out what the independent variable is, the dependent variable, and if there is also a third variable. So look at the first sentence. Low self-esteem is linked to an increase in speech anxiety. So what are the variables? Now remember, variables are what varies, the qualities that vary. There are two qualities in that sentence that vary. One of them, of course, would be self-esteem. It can be low, it can be high. Self-esteem is one of our variables. The other variable would be speech anxiety, which can also vary. You can have low or high speech anxiety. So those are the two variables. The only question then is which one is presumed to be the cause and which one is presumed to be the effect. And just from reading that sentence, I think we get a pretty clear sense that self-esteem would be the cause. The amount of self-esteem you have causes either an increase or a decrease in speech anxiety. So speech anxiety would be the effect. Self-esteem is the cause, speech anxiety is the effect. So remember, the cause is the independent variable. Self-esteem would be our independent variable, speech anxiety, the dependent. Let's look at the next sentence, which is a little bit trickier. Men tend to watch action films and women tend to watch romantic comedies. Again, we have two variables, but the variables are not directly stated in the sentence. You kind of have to reason them out. There are two qualities that vary in that sentence. One quality that varies would be sex or gender, men versus women. So sex or gender would be one of the variables. Now, the sentence never actually uses the word sex or gender, but that's obviously what it's getting at by distinguishing between men and women. The other variable in that sentence would be genre, film genre. And again, the word genre, it does not appear anywhere in the sentence, but the sentence talks about action films versus romantic comedies. We know that those are two genres of film. So the two variables we will say are sex and genre. The only question is, which one is the independent, which is the dependent? So it looks to me in that sentence like it's saying whether someone is male or female is going to determine or influence what kinds of films they watch. So sex would be our independent variable, and film genre would be the dependent. Let's look at the third example. Okay, this one gets even more complicated. Accredited public relations practitioners report higher levels of organizational management than do non-accredited public relations practitioners. Now, you might look at that sentence right away and say, well, I know public relations practitioners has got to be one of those variables. It is not. Public relations practitioners are people. They just kind of exist. They do not vary in this sentence. The people themselves are not variables. It's the quality of those people that varies. So the quality that varies would be their level of accreditation, either accredited or non-accredited. So accreditation is going to be one of our variables, and the other variable would be organizational management, right? So it looks here like, I have to look at the sentence again to make sure I understand it. Accredited public relations practitioners report higher levels of organizational management. So it looks like whether or not they're accredited influences or determines the level of organizational management. So accreditation would be our independent variable and organizational management, the dependent. Let's look at the final example. The use of photographs increases readers' comprehension of newspaper articles, but only among men. Okay. So what do we have as far as variables? We have use of photographs. That would be a variable. The photographs themselves are not a variable, right? But use of photographs is our variable. And then the other variable would be comprehension. Right? It's not the newspaper articles themselves that are the variable here. It's the comprehension of them. So comprehension would be a variable. So use of photographs would be our independent. Comprehension would be our dependent. But now we also have a third variable, because it looks like this relationship is only true among men. So sex or gender would be a third variable. It would be one of those intervening variables that interferes with or intervenes in the relationship between the independent and the dependent. So gender or sex in this case would be an example of a third variable. So as you're thinking about your own research interests and research topics, figure out what would the concepts be that you would explore. How might you turn those concepts into measurable variables? And what would the independent and what would the dependent variable be among those variables? So see if you can apply these terms to your own areas of interest.